Okay, welcome. I'm Stephanie Jones-Manton. I'm the head of the Scottish studio at JamFactory. Normally Brian Parks gets this gig. He's our CEO, but he's in Melbourne Design Week, so unfortunately we get me instead. Anyway, so firstly, I'd like to begin with acknowledging the traditional owners of the land which we meet today. I would also like to pay many respects to elders past and present. So, for those that don't know, Gerry Wedd, Gerry is one of Australia's most celebrated ceramicists who's been making pots for, we said 50 years? But you're saying 40?
I've been playing with clay for 50 years, yeah.
50 years, so I was right.
Yeah.
Okay. So, anyway, so his work runs the gamut from functional domestic wear to large installation works and public art. For 20 years, he actually worked as an illustrator for Mambo, producing works for T-shirts and fabric prints. Gerry has exhibited extensively in Australia and internationally, including the Havana Biennale, Expo JamFactory, Ian Potter's Museum of Art and the Victoria Albert Museum, and has been the recipient of numerous awards, including the Herber Arts Prize, the Sidney Myer Fund International Ceramics Awards, and is represented by major public collections across Australia and I'm sure internationally as well. So please put your hands together and give Gerry a very warm welcome.
I might do this. I can't walk around with this because I have wind and you never know what might happen. So I haven't timed any of this. Someone warned me to not have too many slides. Basically today I'm going to talk about influence. Different kinds of things that have influenced the way I work, why I work. And celebrate me, obviously. Wedwood. I'm one of those people who I'm walking around with the history of pottery in my head. So every day I'm thinking about things made in the past, things made in the present, all kinds of work that's made from clay. Okay, so I grew up in a very small house in Port Noarlunga. There were 8 of us living in the house. Lots of books, but I spent lots of time in front of the television. And as I was growing up, I watched and rewatched movies to do with mythology on television at the midday movies, Sunday morning movies. One of my favourites being the Ray Harryhausen skeletons from Sinbad. No. Is it Sinbad? No, from Jason the Argonauts, and also Sinbad the Sailor. The thing I loved about, well, I don't know why I love these things so much, but they excited my imagination. And later I realised that through popular culture, all of those myths had been changed and morphed and put together to get more exciting creatures. So although the Cyclops was from Sinbad the Sailor, it came from Greek mythology. So the Hollywood guys were going for the best kinds of stories. So this is me facing a life of pottery, tied to the mast, trying to keep away from all those sirens that are working in the kitchen near the studio. And so a lot of those things went straight into my work. So 40 years later, when I had to do some drawings for Mambo to be turned into shirts, I went back to those films and illustrated the film. And this is a fabric that became a kind of Hawaiian shirt. But instead of surfers and mermaids, we have Prometheus and all kinds of references to Greek mythology. And also, when I began working at Mambo, this was the very first drawing I ever sent. When I think I was studying at Underdale, And I sent Mambo some drawings, and this also is drawing from Greek mythology. So we've got Narcissus surfing, surrounded by sirens and things. In the house I grew up in, there were a lot of books, and my mother was an avid reader and read to me quite a lot. And one of my favourite things was the Just So stories by Rudyard Kipling. And I know Rudyard Kipling is not very fashionable anymore, but I think this is where I got a love for imagery and text, and for the idea of narrative and the idea of illustrated narrative. And also just a love for language. If you read this out in your head, it's got this beautiful kind of playful, melodic thing going on. I spent a lot of time in the tree out the front of the house, daydreaming in Port Noarlunga. This isn't me. This is a still from a thing called The Singing Detective by my favourite creative, Dennis Potter, who was a writer and screenwriter and made various television shows that, again, excited my imagination. Dennis Potter put music and stories together and used music to underline what was going on in the films. Again, in the house in Port Noarlunga, we had a set of Encyclopaedia Britannicas, which I looked through a lot, and because the first encyclopedia is A, of course, and so you flick to the coloured plates and you've got art. And I saw things like the Merritt Oppenheim Fur Cup and Saucer. I was very young. I had no idea what this was about. I think a fur cup has a lot of different meanings, but it was the strangeness of these associations that excited me. Another artist that I saw in these pages was Victor Brauner, who is still one of my favourite artists. For some reason, even when I was very young, it was the surrealists I was interested in. This is another Victor Brauner. It's called Wolf Table. I love the idea of a wild animal running around in a domesticated space, and I've always been interested in the idea of domestication. And so I quite often steal ideas. And so by the time I went to Underdale and studied ceramics, those ideas were still running around in my head. And so this is a kind of a fruit bowl, but again, based on the idea of a kind of wild creature that's been tamed and brought into a domestic sphere. And so later on, after I studied at Underdale, I went to the JamFactory, and in the first couple of years, I was in a small show at the JamFactory. And again, I wanted to bring wild animals into the domestic space. So these are terracotta dogs, but they're glass top coffee tables. It's kind of a weak joke, but yeah, just bringing wild animals into space. The biggest influence on me, as it turns out, and I didn't know this for years and years, was my mother, who began making pots in her 40s on the kitchen table in our house at Port Noarlunga. She had a big influence on me. That's my mother shooting the bow. I don't know, I'm not sure which one she is. And that's me, age 12, obviously very influenced by my mother. These are the kind of pots my mother made on the kitchen table. She had no real interest in ceramics, but my sister was bored and wanted to do something, so they enrolled in a hobby class. And my sister quit the class very quickly, and my mother was obsessed. She'd had to bake a lot because there were so many people in the family, and so she used lots and lots of pastry. And I think that pastry making made her a natural hand builder. So she used all those same kitchen techniques to build objects. And the thing I've come to really appreciate about what she made is that she only made them for herself. This is around the time, you could look at this and then go and look at the Milton Moon show, and this is kind of when those works were being made. And my mother was a great gardener, but she wasn't interested in trying to replicate the spirit of the Australian bush or any of those things. She just wanted to make some nice things that you could put olive oil in or vinegar. And she made thousands of pots, and quite often, in fact, most of the time they were made either in the kitchen or in front of the television. Sorry, I've got to get a drink. Give me a sec. I didn't think I would be nervous, but all you kids out there, speaking in front of people is not natural. So this is the kind of thing that I think my mother was influenced by. And this is Margaret Preston cup and saucer. And as it happens, probably made not too far from our family home. It was probably made in Ranella, which was kind of just up the road. And years later, when I got interested in blue and white and saw this at the Art Gallery of South Australia, I was very influenced by this. I started, Port Noarlunga's by the sea. I started surfing when I was about 11 years old. And from the first day that I went surfing, I understood that it was going to be the most important thing in my life. And I just wondered how I could do it all of the time. And then I saw my mother making pots at home on the kitchen table, firing them in a tiny kiln, selling them in a little craft shop down the road, and making, a meagre amount of money. And I thought, this is a pretty good idea. It was kind of a countercultural idea that I could just make things, maybe at night, and then surf all day. And so that really did have a lot to do with why I leaned towards ceramics, because I had this kind of model in the household. And these are the kinds of things, kind of culturally inappropriate things that my mother made. So after a few years of making things, she decided she wanted to have illustrations on the work. And I was a kid that always drew. So she would say to me, "Oh, Gerry, could you draw a Chinaman on a cup?" And I didn't care. And I thought what she made was rubbish. So I was quite happy to draw all over her pots. I seriously had no investment in any of this. And again, at this time, you weren't meant to, if you were going to make a mark on a pot, it had to be iron oxide with a giant Japanese or Chinese brush. Not this kind of naive, inappropriate kind of drawing. So, and yes, these were made from a pipe clay made by a company called Rockler. And I used to have to get the bus from Port Noarlunga and go and get the clay and get like 2 bags of clay and get back on the bus, and also go down to Bob Micken's pug mill and spend a fortune on not much. And again, the influence of Greek mythology kept coming at me. And when I started looking at the pots, I realised that the reason we knew so much about Greek mythology was either from the spoken word or from the myths that were drawn around those pots. And again, quite often, the illustrations on the pots were coupled with text. So again, there was this marriage of text and imagery. I've always been a giant fan of listening to music, and when I was younger, I was as interested in the packaging of the music as the music. And this is the cover of an album called The Hissing of Summer Lawns by Joni Mitchell, who is probably my favourite writer, and she's also a really good designer and illustrator. Again, this idea of mythology and drawing. This is a work from one of the first works that I made where I used some kind of mythology, song lines, and a reference to the forms of Greek pots. I think this was made in third year at Underdale in the ceramics course. I was trying to learn how to put pots together, trying to learn how to make things. And I think this is from a Joni Mitchell song called Wild Things Run Fast. In the late 80s, early 90s, I discovered the graphic novel, which again was another text and image idea. I love the fact that the story is being told either in just images or the text was up in the corner giving you some idea of what was going on. These two are from a magazine called Raw, which was a fantastic magazine put together by Art Spiegelman, who later became famous for a thing called Mouse. This is Charles Burns, and that's Gary Panter, and Gary Panter, as it happens, also did a bit of work. He was an American artist, did a bit of work for Mambo. Big influence on what I was doing. When I started getting interested in making big pots, I didn't know how to do it. Physically, it seemed very difficult. Kilns weren't big enough to make giant work. And then I came across the work of Viola Fry, who's standing there in the corner. All of these giant figures are her work. Incredible artist. So you can see she made these pieces in segments. So you can see the lines, not these lines, but the lines cutting through the figures. So she would start building, get to a certain point, and I guess put a layer of plastic, then keep building, another layer of plastic, then pull the things apart and fire them separately. There's another shot of Viola Frey's work. And in fact, I completely, I made some work at the Underdale campus that borrowed very, very heavily from her work. In fact, there's one of the pieces. I wasn't as good at the joins as she was, but you can see this thing that's in our garden now, because that's where most big pots end up, because no one will buy them, is probably it was about 3 meters high all up. So, and I love the idea that you could make small things and just stack them. You can see by the way I've modelled the face and the hands and stuff that it's borrowing very heavily from Viola Fry and also from those kind of Raw magazine drawings. Another huge influence is Margaret Dodd, an Adelaide artist who made me think differently about clay, I think, because up until I saw her work, I'd largely been making work that was pot-based. And I wasn't aware of the potential of other objects. Even though I've gone back and historically seen ancient objects, carts and houses and things, she made me think about the direct relationship between popular culture, my culture, and making things. This is her red brick clay combi. Weirdly, when I started looking at influences, they were kind of 80% women. This is Olive Bishop, another fantastic, kind of unheralded or almost forgotten South Australian artist who became famous for a series called Wash and War, which you may have seen in the Art Gallery in South Australia. A bunch of shirts with different messages on the tags and things. When I was studying at Underdale, we had a throwing teacher called Helen Hurd, who was pretty tough, and you would be given, I think, a pound of clay, and you were meant to throw a perfect cylinder like 11 inches high or whatever. And I was really struggling in throwing, and then luckily she broke her Achilles tendon, and so they had to get a new lecturer in, and this fellow, Chris Headley, was fresh from the UK, and I think he'd just studied at Central St Martin's in London. So he came into the course, and he had very different ideas about making, very different ideas about throwing, and also brought along screen printing and all kinds of clay inlay and all of these really exciting new things. Well, new to me at the time. And was also very generous with praise. And he was one of the first lecturers that made me think that you could have a personal voice and was worth pursuing. It wasn't necessarily about, throwing 200 perfect things and considering volume, form and decoration. His work was more open-ended, I think, or his approach. I'm just kind of jumping from influence to influence. This is one of my favourite things ever, and it's a tile from the collection in the Victoria and Albert Museum. A fritware tile, so it's ceramic, but it's not ceramic as we know it. And just the marriage of glaze, colour and line and narrative gets me every time. I spent hours staring at tiles in the V&A. I don't know what I was expecting to get from them, but I think it's just beauty that got me in. And also introduced me to the potential of tiles to do different things. Another incredible tile project is this project which Bronwyn Kemp did in the old JamFactory at St. Peter's, which was a chook shed. I think it's called Essentials. And just a beautiful, thoughtful work and incredibly executed. All of these tiles are inlaid. So she's cut into the tiles, into the red clay, put white clay in, scrape back. And she's just a natural pattern maker as well. I've realised recently that I've stole quite a few things from Bronwyn. I remember late one night she was decorating bowls with a ashtray full of cigarette butts, cigarette hanging out of the side of her mouth, and she was painting a power plug on a traditional blue and white plate. And I hadn't realised that was stuck back there in my memory and that I'd copied it quite a few times recently. And another fantastic tile project, which if anyone that knows my work would know I've borrowed from heavily. This is an American artist called Anne Agee, who I think it's called the Sheboygan bathroom. Where she was working at one of the huge American ceramic and tile companies who have an artist's residency. So she got the whole piece made for her, and then she decorated it with images to do with the local area and to do with the workers that worked there. About 20 years ago, I was leafing through a magazine called The World of Interiors, which is the best ceramics magazine in the world. And I came across this fantastic photo, and it's Victor Hugo's living room. And it was just, again, I don't know what it was that really excited me about it, but it stuck in my memory, and I always thought it would be fantastic to be able to build an interior covered in blue and white tiles, but I don't see, you'll see that's a giant H. So I think Victor Hugo was quite an egomaniac. The rest of the house looks amazing too. So this is my Victor Hugo's house. This is a work I was commissioned to do at ACE, across from the JamFactory. Liz Nell, who was the director at the time, just asked me to do something I would always like to have done, and to do a large project. And so I had some builders build a small room, which I clad nearly entirely in tiles. There was a wall of plates as well. But it was a very indulgent work in that it was the idea. I didn't ever think I would own a house because of what I do. And so the idea of homelessness was often in my head. And so this was like a ceramic version of something you could live in. So this is a pillow down in the corner, a waste bucket for whatever waste will go in it, and then a small table and a basin and a jug and those kind of rudimentary things that a person might need. And the walls, like, the tiles have got all kinds of decorations on them. A lot of the text from the tiles is from pop songs, a lot of aphorisms, and there are also a lot of pictures of homeless people scattered around. I think it was kind of ambitious. I'm not sure I got exactly where I wanted to get with it, but it was a fantastic opportunity, which led in the end to this piece that's on at the moment at the Art Gallery in New South Wales in a thing called The National. And the curator approached me because of Instagram, so no arguments here about Instagram. And I just got a message asking if I had done that work not the work at ACE, another outdoor work that was in Sydney of blue and white tiles, and then contacted me and asked me to be involved in this. So I spent a few months making tiles, using tiles from the previous project, and then made this like a version of a gentleman's room. This is my version of the Victor Hugo room. And it's pretty much a celebration of myself in a peculiar way. And again, all the text on there is from popular songs. And where I'll take a phrase from a popular song, take it out of its context, where it becomes a kind of aphorism. In the kind of when towards the end of art school, I started seeing really interesting work coming out of Sydney that was a long way from the traditional stoneware tradition, mainly by two artists, Patsy Healy and Tony Warburton. And it was work that drew more from culture, not so much from a particularly pottery culture, from 50s design, all kinds of other areas. And it was really exciting to see. This is a Tony Warburton. And it made me reconsider the kinds of things I was making. And I got much more interested in the kind of china cabinet ceramics, the kind of ceramics that you inherit that your grandmother might have, or something you didn't really have a great attachment to, but that attachment came through time. I became interested in those things. Post JamFactory, I needed a place to work. Joe Crawford needed a place to work. Peter Johnson needed a place to work, and Philip Hart needed a place to work. And I think Joe or Pete eventually found an old scout hall in Welland, which we called Jamboree, and set up as a group workshop. which lasted, I think I was there for 10 years, and it lasted a lot longer. And most luminaries, if there can be a clay luminary, most of them came through and did some work there at some stage or exhibited there. We had Fiona Hall exhibit there under a pseudonym. It was fantastic. We pooled resources, we ate together, we had lunch together, we applied for grants together and had little exhibitions. If there are any kids out there, I think it's still a really strong model to, as a way of embarking on some kind of career, I suppose. This is not ceramic. This is in the same vein as Patsy Healy and Tony Warburton. Joe Crawford drew from kind of what I call China cabinet works, and made overtly kind of Rococo kind of works. But this is made from, what's it made from? Banksia leaves, yeah. It's not clay pretending to be Banksia leaves. So this is one of Joe's works. Again, another artist that worked at Jamboree is Philip Hart. I'm not sure that machine does kill fascists, but I think a kick wheel kills fascists, but not an electric wheel. Phil was... The great thing about Jamboree was that I think we all shared particular sensibilities about making work, and mainly there was a kind of quality control that you inherited from when you opened the kiln and someone commented on what you were doing. A lot of silent critique. We had come from the JamFactory where Bronwyn ruled it with a not-so-silent critique. I think we were a bit easier on ourselves than Bronwyn was. Another big influence was Bruce Nussky, who with Paul Greenaway and Mark Thompson brought an aesthetic and approach that it seems, looking back, was a very Adelaide kind of aesthetic. Bruce is an incredible maker, still is an incredible maker, and another big influence on the way I approach decorating pots in Sgraffito. Frighteningly good at making things. Another big influence on me was Mexican folk pottery and folk potteries from all over the world. And again, work that was less about any idea of form and taste, but more about a kind of personal relationship to work. So I was really trying to make antiques in a way. And again, drawing a lot from popular culture. I think the Wim Wenders film, Wings of Desire, they were kind of overwrought and overlaid with things. I wanted them to be like wedding cakes. I wanted the stuff to look like icing. I seem to always go from the miniature to large, and I wanted to make really big pots, and there's no way I can make really big pots. So I got Mark Heidenreich, who had done a lot of work for Stephen Bowers. It took me about 2 years to get Mark to agree for me to ruin his pots, but eventually I did, and we made together a series of things that I called love trophies. And this is Love is Crucial, Money is Everything, which is from a song by Stephen Cummings. This is another instance of being influenced by Mexican folk art. These are these tiny little tin, are they called retablos? Is there anyone Mexican out there? Again, wild imagery and text, so that if you didn't know what was going on in this painting of two wrestlers having a bath while Guadalupe was watching, then it would tell you the story along the bottom. myself and my wife were so interested in Mexican folk art and a lot of things to do with Mexico that we went to Mexico on quite a long trip. And I went into one of the museums and saw all of this fantastic blue and white work that had come to Mexico via the Spanish. And the thing I've always loved about blue and white is the way it has travelled from nation to nation, largely through trade, and everything is borrowed. And the blue and white tradition has been so borrowed that I feel like it's open. I'm not treading on anyone's toes by using imagery and forms and things. So things like the little bits of the willow pattern, all kinds of things just travelled across nations. So another Mexican, is this the Mexican version of the willow pattern? I'm not sure. And so I borrowed very heavily from the willow pattern here and started to use it as a backdrop in much the same way as Stephen Bowers does, and insert little bits of Australian popular culture into the story. Because the willow pattern is a story plate, obviously, and so I thought it would be fun to play with the kind of tropes of the pattern. And you could probably see by earlier slides, I've often tried to bring the drawing off from the object. And I started to do that with the willow pattern, and then I thought, no, why don't I just reimagine the two-dimensional drawing as a three-dimensional object? And so most of the parts of the apple tree and the willow tree, and if you look at the willow pattern, it's quite ridiculous if you isolate those things. So it was an exercise in me reimagining what things could be in 3 dimensions. This is something that led on from doing the willow pattern and from doing blue and white work. I was approached by a filmmaker called Mark Patterson to do a virtual reality story based on my drawings and based on the Fleurieu Peninsula, and he wanted me to come up with a narrative and somehow turn this into a virtual reality project. The virtual reality didn't pan out, but we turned it into I don't know what it's called, but into a show that I had at the art gallery last year, which was a surround screen with a very simple narrative about how we're ruining the world and we're all going to drown. This was a fantastic thing to do. So I made quite a few objects from ceramic. They took 3D scans of them. They built the forest. I taught myself on a program called Procreate to do very simplistic stop animation. So these were little. So the kangaroo is paper, and all of the rest was ceramic. Just quickly, last year was probably the most interesting year I've ever had in that I did that last project. I did the wall thing for the Art Gallery in New South Wales, and also I got approached by a jeweller called Carl Fritsch who asked me to make some beer steins. And I made the steins, and then I sent them to New Zealand where he lives half the time, and he made the lids and ended up making these fantastical kind of objects that I could never imagine doing. And it's quite interesting when someone takes your images, icons and input and then translates them. I guess maybe he's used to translating things. But the lids were incredibly detailed, and each lid was probably worth about 12 of my steins, because he calls himself a punk jeweller, and he's very cavalier with valuable objects and precious stones. So fantastic. And again, I just got a message over Instagram, saying we should do some work together. And this person's had a large influence on my life. This is my wife, Krista Rosa, who's a printmaker and a gardener and a cook and a swimmer and a mother. And we're back to the whole reason I started doing all of this in the first place. Unfortunately, I can't really stand on a surfboard anymore, but this is a photo taken last year. Accidentally, a guy was walking past, and there's a place called Radalang, or the Chicken Run, just walking distance from my house. And this is me laying down on an inflatable mattress, trying to get in the tube. Warning, kids, I actually got thrown all over those rocks a couple of waves later. And so that's basically the end of what I wanted to say. But yeah, surfing probably has still played the biggest influence of all. That's it.